Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mr. Acom?
Here.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Here.
Mrs. Schneider?
Here.
Mr. Cebulski?
Here.
And Mrs. Click.
Here.
All right, the first resolution on the agenda this evening is a resolution to elect the board president for 2025. May I have a motion?
Not, right, somebody needs to nominate.
I nominate Pam Mahalis as president.
I will second that.
Okay. Are there any other nominations? Okay, there being none, I'll call the roll. Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mr. Acom?
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Okay. Vote.
Yeah, I have it
Just have to sign that. So raise
So,
your right
okay.
hand and
there. I, Pam Mahalis, do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States of America, the Constitution of the State of Ohio, and that I will faithfully and impartially discharge my duties as President of the School Board in and for the said Aurora City School District, Aurora, Ohio, to the best of my ability and in accordance with the laws now in effect and hereafter to be enacted during my continuance in said office and until my successor is elected and qualified.
just sign it when you have a chance.
Okay, sign it out.
Okay.
All right. All right, thank you all. So now, the next order of business is to elect a board vice president, and I would like to nominate Steve Cebulski. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Are there any other nominations for vice president? There being none, Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Acom?
Yes.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Right hand.
I, Steve Cebulski, do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States of America and the Constitution of the State of Ohio, and I will faithfully and impartially discharge my duties as Vice President of the School Board and for the said City School District, Ohio, to the best of my ability in accordance with the laws now in effect and thereafter and enacted before my continuance in said office and until my successor is elected and qualified.
Congratulations. Pass it down the middle.
All right, next we have Exhibit A3, which is we have Exhibit A. Is it A3? Yeah.
A3, yeah.
Oh, it's a resolution to authorize the treasurer to file Form 904, which is the certification of members and officers of the board. May I have a motion, please?
Move.
Any addition or any edits to these? Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes.
Mr. Acom?
Yes. All right, and then on to board organizational matters. We have Exhibit B1, which is a resolution to adopt a tentative board meeting calendar for 2025. May I have a motion, please?
Moved. Second.
Any comments or questions about those dates? All right, Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mr. Acom?
Yes. Exhibit B2 is a resolution to approve the purchase of liability insurance for each board member. May I have a motion, please? Mr. Volleson, I've asked Mr. Volleson to just give us one or two sentences on each of these as we go through them.
Sure. This obviously is our liability insurance that we have, and It's for the district and obviously for the board members. So we have $1 million each claim with a $2 million aggregate on liability, plus a $4 million umbrella. So basically, roughly $6 million liability insurance, depending upon whatever the claim may be.
All right, any questions? All right, Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mr. Acom?
Yes.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Exhibit B3 is a resolution to establish a board service fund for 2025. May I have a motion?
Move. Second.
Mr. Volleson?
Call the roll, or you want me to?
No, I just wanted you to,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
So
just-
this is when, say, for instance, you guys go to OSBA, the money comes out of this particular account, and any type of trainings or meetings that you guys would go to get reimbursed for, whether it be registrations, travel, so on and so forth, all comes out of the service fund. So that's the main use of this particular fund.
okay, any questions? All right, Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Acom?
Yes.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Exhibit B4 is a resolution to approve Board of Education membership in OSBA and OSBA Legal Assistance Fund. May I have a motion?
Moved.
Second.
All right, Mr. Volleson?
Yes, so we are a member of OSBA, and we have been, and we've also used the Legal Assistance Fund. And honestly, in my 25 years, I think we've used it once, and when we did use it, it was when Mr. Ames challenged us about a year or two ago, as he did a bunch of school districts around the state, and OSBA actually paid our legal expenses for that. So it kind of paid for itself multiple times over with that. So it kind of covered a cost that we paid all the other years.
Okay, any questions? All right, please call the roll.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Acom?
Yes.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes. Exhibit B5 is a resolution to appoint a board member as OSBA Ohio Legislative Liaison and Student Achievement Legislative Liaison. And Mrs. Click has agreed to do that for us this year. Are there any comments or questions? All right, Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
I need a motion.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Flanagan. Chair said, okay. Now please call the roll.
Okay. Mr. Acom?
Yes.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Exhibit B6 is a resolution to appoint a representative to the Aurora City Government and Tax Incentive Review Council. I have been doing that. I'm happy to do it again unless somebody else really wants it. May I have a motion for approval?
Moved.
All right. Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mr. Acom?
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
All right, on to other organizational and action items. We have Exhibit C1, which is a resolution to fix, accept, and approve surety bonds for board members and the superintendent. May I have a motion?
Moved. Second.
Mr. Volleson, would you just tell us
Yeah,
about this?
this is obviously a surety bond, so this would be if in some way that either board members or the superintendent would abscond with funds. This is basically a policy which would, pay the district back $20,000, up to $20,000 for each of the individuals, if anything like that would happen.
All right. Please call the roll.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mr. Acom?
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes. Exhibit C2 is a resolution to approve the treasurer's bond. May I have a motion?
Second.
Mr. Volleson?
This being the same, only mine is 5 times as large, obviously. I have more access to
'Cause you have
funds
all
than...
the- You have all the passwords.
Right, so I have more access than everybody else. The treasurer's bonds are always at the 100,000 mark versus the 20.
All right, please call the roll.
Mr. Acom?
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Exhibit C3 is a resolution to purchase liability insurance for the list of people you see there, volunteers, and, individuals and groups. May I have a motion, please?
Moved.
Mr. Volleson?
Okay, this is, again, similar to the prior resolution, which was for the board and board members. Now, this is just getting into then the individual folks here in the district, from treasurer, superintendent, administrative, teacher, so on and so forth. So basically the same insurance, just a separate resolution taking it down to the individuals who, and volunteers, I guess, who are involved with the district.
All right, please call the roll.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Acom? Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes. Exhibit C4 is a resolution to approve standing authorizations. May I have a motion?
Moved.
Chair seconds. Mr. Volleson?
Okay, these are all the different things that allow the treasurer, myself, and superintendent, Mr. Roberto, to pretty much handle the day-to-day business of the district. So an example, the first one is to secure advances from the auditor. So what I'll do tomorrow is send them a copy of the resolution allowing us to get tax advances, which we'll receive in the month of February. So I have to include this, so now as the board has allowed me to do that. Same thing, the next one, invest interim funds. This allows me to invest money in Star Ohio and other sources, as long as it coincides with what our investment policy is. So on and so forth. You could see all the different things in here. On the second page, you could see authorized releases for the purpose of interscholastic athletic eligibility. So obviously that's a superintendent that would go through. So there's all kind of different things that these things allow us to run the district on a day-to-day basis without having to basically get you guys together and have a vote every time we want to do something. So without this, it would, you'd have like board meetings every other day, and it would really slow down the operations of the district.
Is this the same as last year?
Yeah.
Any changes? Any other questions? Please call the roll.
Mr. Acom?
Yes.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Exhibit C5 is a resolution to appoint the superintendent as the purchasing agent and safety coordinator. May I have a motion? Any questions, Mr. Volleson?
Again, superintendent is the purchasing agent, so he in the end has to approve all of any purchase orders that go through the district. So, we have our particular policy where the, building administrator approves them, then it goes to the superintendent for approval before it could become a purchase order. And obviously, as the safety coordinator, that's, again, anything that involves any of our OSHA, which are requirements and everything else that has to flow through to comply with, workers' compensation laws and everything else.
Okay. All right, please call the roll.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Acom? Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes. Exhibit C6 is a resolution to approve the alternative tax budget. May I have a motion?
Moved.
Mr. Volleson?
Okay, the alternative tax budget, again, another annual thing that we do. This has to be approved by the 15th of January. And what I do then, upon its approval, tomorrow I'll send this down to the county auditor. And what this does is allows them to issue us our first certificate of estimated resources for next fiscal year. So what that is then used for is when we set our budget before the end of this fiscal year for the beginning of next fiscal year, so we could start operations in the beginning of July. So for the most part, as you'll see in there, it has all of our particular levies are listed in there, and their millages and the amounts of dollars they bring in. The main funds, tax funds, there's a general fund, and the items on there pretty much coincide with our 5-year forecast. Then there's the debt service fund, which is, for our bonds, and those tie in with what our debt requirements are for next fiscal year and the beginning of the following fiscal year. And then finally, the permanent improvement fund, which is the other tax-related fund for tax dollars that we receive. So it kind of outlines the, again, expected revenues, the expenditures out of that fund for the next year and a half. And then all the other various funds that we have throughout the district are on the following pages. Those pretty much tie into what we've, where we're at now in the fiscal year, looking at what we've used and received in previous fiscal years, and I develop it from there. And so the main thing with this is, again, they set the certificate of estimated resources. They actually used the bond thing to determine how much money that the debt service fund needs to raise so that we could pay for all of the debt that we have incurred. And so that is that.
Any questions? All right, Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mr. Akam? Mrs. Click?
Yes.
All right, Exhibit C7 is a resolution to permit board members, the superintendent, and treasurer to attend appropriate seminars and conferences. May I have a motion? Any comments or questions? That one's self-explanatory. Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mr. Akam? Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Exhibit C8 is a resolution to approve school attorneys. May I have a motion?
Second.
Are these all the same? Any difference from last year?
No, these are the same that we had last year, and different ones we've used for different things. So actually, Reeds, Paul, and Shore, we haven't really used them in a while, but they're local, so they've kind of been on there, but I honestly couldn't tell you the last time we've used them. I use Squires, Patton, and Boggs, mostly for financial things, like the past bond issue, that's who we worked with. And I also use them for all of our Emma filings. Weston Hurd typically has been special education, as I believe Walter Haverfield. And Ennis Britton, that's Bob McBride, who he's with, and that's who we have our contract with. And so they really are involved more in the day-to-day legal things that we may have. And they also represent us when we do go into negotiations, which we will be doing this spring sometime.
Okay, any comments or questions? Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Akam? Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes. Exhibit C9 is a resolution to appoint the district HIPAA security administrator, that being Mr. Roberto. May I have a motion?
Second.
Any comments or questions? Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mr. Akam? Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes. Exhibit C10 is a resolution to appoint the district's civil rights coordinator, compliance officer, grievance officer, and ADA compliance officer. Those jobs being shared between Dr. Milsitich and Mr. Maglianico. May I have a motion for approval?
Moved.
Any comments or questions? Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mr. Akam? Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Exhibit C11 is a resolution naming the treasurer as public records training designee. May I have a motion?
Moved.
Chair seconds. Any comments or questions? Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mr. Akam? Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Exhibit C12 is a resolution to appoint the district privacy official and asbestos management designated person, that being the treasurer. May I have a motion, please?
Moved.
Second.
Any comments or questions? Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mr. Akam? Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Mrs. Mahalis?
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski?
Yes.
All right, all those resolutions are approved. Now we have 3 items under new business. One was added to the table when we got here. Exhibit D1 is a resolution to employ 2 long-term substitute teachers for the rest of the school year. May I have a motion?
Second.
Any comments or questions? Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mrs. Schneider?
Yes.
Mrs. Click?
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski,
Yes.
Mr. Akam,
Yes.
Mrs. Mahalis.
Yes. Exhibit D2 is a resolution to award teacher a one-year limited contract. May I have a motion, please?
Moved.
Second.
I have a question. Is this a new, I'm just not remembering if we've been told about this. Do you remember?
I believe you were. So Marina Ergun, who had previously been our psychologist at Craddock, decided she was going to retire in the middle of the year.
Oh.
So we had to replace her. So this is not a long-term sub. It's Yiddy beginning right now, and then planning on continuing that moving forward in the next year.
All right, any other questions? Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mrs. Click,
Yes.
Mrs. Mahalis,
Yes.
Mr. Akam,
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski,
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider.
Yes.
And Exhibit D3 is a resolution to adjust the starting date of support staff. May I have a motion, please?
Moved.
Second.
Any questions? Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mr. Akam,
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski,
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider,
Yes.
Mrs. Click,
Yes.
Mrs. Mahalis.
Yes. All right, that concludes the regular part of our meeting, and now we would like to move into executive session. May I have a motion to do that? This is for the reason of personnel. May I have a
Second.
second? Okay, second. Mr. Volleson, please call the roll.
Mrs. Mahalis.
Yes.
Mr. Cebulski,
Yes.
Mr. Akam,
Yes.
Mrs. Schneider,
Yes.
and Mrs. Click.
Yes.
Thank you. I've asked Mr. Volleson to stay for it, so. Oh, yeah.